So let's go to the people in Angola who are voting in a general election, which is expected to be the most closely fought since the country's independence in 1975. The call to vote and stay is coming from the long-time opposition party, the Union for the Total Independence of Angola, known as UNITA, which says a large presence of people at polling places is needed to keep the elections accurate. President João Lourenço is running for a second five-year term, while his party, the People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, known by its Portuguese acronym MPLA, is campaigning to extend its 47-year run as the country's ruling party. Leading the competition is the United Patriotic Front Coalition, which includes UNITA and its presidential candidate, Adalberto Costa Jr.
We thank the government and armed forces for holding these elections in a civilized manner, with respect, tranquility and peace.
Why vote? The vote has already been decided. We already know who is going to win the elections. Here it is obligatory for the people to vote. If it wasn't for that, it wouldn't be necessary.
I hope to vote tomorrow. I hope it will be done peacefully, that everyone votes calmly, for there to be no confusion, and may the best man win.
Angola is Africa's second largest oil and gas producer and exporter, and all eyes are on these elections as the incumbent president, João Lourenço's popularity ratings have declined since he came into power in September of 2017. Angola faces economic difficulties compounded by the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic despite its very rich hydrocarbon and other resources. Joining me to discuss this tonight is an international journalist and political economist, Joseph Ochieno. Good evening to you, sir, and welcome to the program. I'm sure in your days as an international reporter based in London, I'm sure you've covered Angola, what was part of your political coverage. So give me a bit of the economic and political background of Angola between the former president Dos Santos and the incumbent president João Lourenço.
You are absolutely right. I did not only cover Angola politically, as a journalist, but and a writer, in fact, but more as an activist. The Angolan War of independence was one of the most vicious, and after independence, UNITA and Jonas Savimbi, and then the now late President Dos Santos were battled into a war, particularly that was really, really one of the saddest in that region. But going forward, Dos Santos is dead. He's the new president now, Lourenço. Lourenço is a slightly softer, younger, but possibly not as charismatic an individual. On the other, the dreaded, if you like the word, Savimbi, Jonas Savimbi of UNITA, who died and is now replaced by a rather charismatic Mr. Junior, Costa Jr. So it makes the entire process very, very interesting. In fact, Junior has shot up the popularity of UNITA. Our life for a democracy is a requirement. Why am I giving that background? That is the background that a country, an oil-rich country like Angola needs, a country that initially was pushing through the line of no-party democracy, but now, mired around multi-partyism, but at the same time, they embraced Western-style democratic reforms. But part of the problem is this, that most of the monies are going to a few individuals, a few Angolans, and in fact, many Portuguese, and hardly any going down to the grassroots. So it's not surprising that as of today, the majority of young people in Angola think they want change, and they think that change they can get from the rather charismatic new guy on the block.
So what do you say, what would you consider as Angola's main Achilles heel for development? Is it corruption, is it politics, or simply governance? How do you think the first 5 years of President João Lourenço had gone?
Lourenço did very well, actually. He hit the ground running, particularly on the battles of corruption. He had the courage to sue some members of the families of our former president, Dos Santos. But that's say corruption still, by and large, remains a big problem in Angola and remains a big problem in most African countries. Beyond that, I think it's really a question of leadership. And this guy is actually, as a matter of interest, UNITA and MPLA have worked together before. So in terms of their politics had terrible bad blood in the 90s. As of today, I think actually, particularly if the parliaments become closer, the 220 or so member parliament comes closer in terms of numbers, if UNITA gains much more seats, it is actually possible that we might actually see a much more competitive polity. So when we have a much more competitive polity, bigger scrutiny, and then perhaps the incumbent having a sense of humility and responsibility and knowing that they can't take the people for granted, nations tend to grow, economies tend to grow, and Angola has got amongst the hugest potential on the African continent. So we wait with massive interest in that front.
Also, like Nigeria, Angola is a hydrocarbon paradise, but Angolans are not living in any socio-economic paradise just like Nigerians. So do you think a new president and a new parliament can deliver that for the Angolans, today's election?
Necessarily sure whether a new president or a new parliament, but I think it's very much about whether or not actually, regardless of the outcome of the elections, it seems to be very likely that MPLA will still possibly win, but with a slightly slimmer majority. But of course, we can still get the shocker that goes to UNITA. The UNITA of today is different from the UNITA of those days. I don't think many people would dread it. But UNITA of today, UNITA was generally a political party associated with capitalism, massively backed by London and Washington. And so for that reason, maybe, I don't know what is new that they would do that actually the Dos Santos government did not do 10 years to his death. So by and large, I think maybe much more about an emphasis. I don't know, particularly in this case, if the UNITA leader comes in as a president, or perhaps if he becomes a much more loud leader of opposition, whether or not they can actually shake corruption and perhaps try and find a way in which there's a coalescing around key issues as far as economic reform is concerned, particularly targeting the youth and then rural Angola, which suffered substantially.
Well, in your informed opinion, how much about the front-running candidates in this presidential election do we know? What could they deliver moving forward? Do you think President Lourenco needs another 5 years to consolidate on what he's done so far? He's talked about corruption, the Sanangol issue is there, a new refinery has been built in Angola, it's pursuing a whole lot more in terms of hydrocarbon. Do you think he needs another 5 more years, or there's a very urgent need for a change of guards in Angola?
Change of guard was needed up to the time before President Lourenco. But to be fair to him, I think actually maybe if he wins this time round, the next 5 years would actually give him the opportunity to consolidate beyond the fight against corruption that he had. And maybe for us to then know him slightly more and better. Ironically, Dos Santos, the man who was actually rapping behind him, has just died. And so it will be a new generation, a new timing, including for MPLA with a new leader, as I said, this time a leader with his own direct mandate, as it were. That said, the UNITA leader, there's not much known about him, except that he's a relatively handsome, relatively charismatic guy, very different from Jonas Savimbi, who was substantially dreaded by many people, including African observers, especially people like ourselves, who actually had very strong views as far as the liberation struggles in Southern Africa was concerned. So not much about either of the two of them, but one thing is certain, that if the election is peaceful, Angola can only be better, especially if the election outcome is not substantially contested, perhaps in the streets, but if contested in the courts, and then there is consensus going forward. I think there is a future and there's a possibility for Angola far much better than most other countries on the continent we can count.
We thank you so much for your time and perspectives. We really appreciate those very rich history of Angola and Africa's politics and economy that you've brought to the conversation tonight. Have a wonderful evening. Ochieno Joseph, international journalist and a political economist out of London tonight.